Namaste. The word fantasy is popular in psychoanalysis and the word surreal in all form of art. However, our guide today, Mr. Himanshu Vaidya, have used the word surreal in a far more fundamental way in terms of its meaning and its action. And let's dive into this pleasure of intellectual feast with our psychoanalysis consultant, Mr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
Sir, so is surreal everywhere? And are we as species soaked in the surreal psychoanalysis, surreal all the time?
Yes, surreal is everywhere. It is everywhere inside and it is everywhere outside. Outside, we are soaked as a species in the surreal all the time, at least today. And it has been so for centuries at different degrees. It was not so intense as it is today. Today, so we are neck deep in the surreal all the time. Just look at the surreal outside, how the surreal is everywhere outside. Step out of the house and you see all the hoardings, so much of corporate communication, events going on, uh, arts and literature all around us, the mythology all around us, the way people talk about fantasies, dreams, and images, the way people embellish the things and talk about them. This is everywhere. The way people dress up, the way people make fashion statements, the way people flash around their cars, the way people prepare their speeches and speak. The surreal is everywhere outside. You can see it in use in political movements, in academic conferences, in entertainment shows, in film and video, in advertisement, everywhere it is there. When you look at inside, in the inside also the surreal is everywhere. It is there in the zone of daydreaming, night dreaming, uh, free associations, unconscious fantasies, as well as in a more subtle way, the way the surreal seeps into all our cognitive processes and sort of dramatizes all our cognitive processes. So the surreal is everywhere and we are soaked in the surreal. The surreal we are soaked in today is not only the surreal created by individuals, but also the surreal created by corporates and the government. So the manufacturing sources of the surreal outside are today different from what they were in the past. And it is no longer the literature, the mythology, the tradition, and the individual who are the sources of the surreal. Large, organized, resourceful entities like the corporates, the media houses, and the government, they are the manufacturing sources of our surreal. And we are soaked into the surreal neck deep today, every day.
So what is the psychological and philosophical significance of this concept as you use it?
Psychologically, the concept of surreal opens up possibilities of conceptual development and therapy approaches in the area of psychology and psychotherapy. The moment you talk of something fantastical as the surreal, the very use of the word and the meaning that it denotes and the way we understand it creates a distance between you and the fantastical entity you talk about. And this distance provides scope for objectivity and a possibility of not being overwhelmed by that entity. And this itself is a great advance in terms of knowing and therapy. It also creates, opens up possibility of looking at the concept of, let us say you join together the East and West and you say corresponding to every elemental motivation, there is a basket full of surreal fantasies. Or to put it in the Eastern language, corresponding to every chakra, there is a basket full of surreal fantasies. And the surreal is operating with regard to every chakra in a particular way. So once you combine the concept of surreal and try to create how the surreal is operating in each chakra, you will create a world of surreal fantasies associated with every chakra, and the way the surreal operates cognitively associated with every chakra. Coming to the tools for healing, right? How is the surreal related to any fundamental motivation or any chakra? How can that be tackled with, managed, or healed? That will give us new insights and a new basket full of tools for understanding pathology, understanding model of the mind, and healing the pathology. That is with respect to uh, the psychological aspect of it. Coming to the philosophical aspect of it, philosophically, it enables us to think of the philosophy of the mind, how that will deal with this surreal, and how the philosophy of mind can look at the way the mind thinks, and the way epistemology can be uh, refined by this using this concept of the surreal. That is one important implication for philosophy of the mind and epistemology. The second important philosophical aspect is this, that we don't get into the surreal consciously. We are hardwired to get into it. It is the way our operating system operates. So our hardware and our operating system are so designed by nature that we get into the surreal right from our birth across our life spontaneously, involuntarily. And this creates a very important question, that whoever has created us for whatever purpose, call it nature or call it God, that force, that entity wants to realize its purpose through our experience of the surreal more than our experience of the real. So the surreal is more important than the real, not only in our experience for ourselves, but for experience of and purpose of that fundamental entity which has created us and which wants us to go in a particular way, and for whom the surreal is more important than the real. So there is a philosophical aspect of a metaphysical aspect of why that fundamental entity wants us to be more in the surreal than in the real. And this is a profound uh, fact for philosophy to engage with. This can also be looked at in evolutionary terms. That is the surreal evolving over the course of human history. And if you look at different periods of human history, say a pre-modern period, the modern period, and the post-modern period, can we talk about the surreal being differently experienced by people and therefore leading to a different quality of life. And this different experiencing of the surreal may well be a part of a larger plan, a larger evolutionary plan of the more fundamental force which is governing human history, if there is such a force. So these are the psychological and philosophical implications of the concept of the surreal. And I'm sure one important psychological aspect is how to get this concept in uh, every school of psychoanalysis and outside of psychoanalysis. For example, if we look at Lacan, how can you cross the concept of the surreal as I have defined it with the concepts of Lacan? Or how do you understand the paranoid schizoid position or the Oedipal fixation or the Oedipus problem using this concept of the surreal? And by using these concept of the surreal, do you get more insights and can you develop more tools? And very importantly, uh, this concept will bring in spirituality and arts, at least in terms of their tools for the healing purpose. So this is the uh, significance of this concept in the area of psychology and philosophy. To the best of what I can see today, I feel intuitively that the significance will be much higher and discovered even more.
So precisely. So when you saying when surreal is so widespread, I mean when it is almost everywhere in everything. So is it? It would be linked to both good and the evil, right?
Yes,
Okay.
because
So
surreal is everywhere, the surreal pervades our ethical discourse also, our ethical thinking also. We can look at so much of mythology related to good and evil, and we can find the surreal there. We don't find the scientific, logical description of anything. We find mythological stories. We even create mythology out of history. Such is our fondness for the surreal. We love myths and legends. And I can tell you one incident of my own childhood. This is about 1982 around. I was a school going child, and there was a school bus. We used to live in a security cantonment at that point, a police cantonment, and there was a school bus which would take us from our colony to the school. And it was driven by a particular person, a driver. And he was known for driving very fast and having a very good control of the vehicle. Once it happened that there were riots in Ahmedabad, and police was deployed to control the riots. And there was a mob which was trying to do some destruction. And this driver reached that spot with his vehicle, which was full of security people inside. And he drove very fast, and the mob had no choice but to disperse. And he drove with very high precision at high speed, which was not doable for every driver. It was spectacular driving. And he made the mob to disperse. He did not injure anybody in the mob, and he also saved the police who was sitting inside the vehicle from being attacked by this mob, which was heavily armed. This was the factual part. Now, the myth which was created by children, right, in the society was this. The myth was this incident was told to children by their fathers, those who were inside that vehicle, that we were inside the vehicle and this is what happened. And the fathers must have added some bit of masala to the facts. And the children added further masala. And the myth which I heard from children was this, that he was driving a truck, not a truck, a vehicle with a lot of people inside, a vehicle which was built on a truck chassis, but was not a truck, it was more like a bus. And when they reached the location of the riot, the site of the riot, this man drove very fast and applied the brake, and the whole vehicle, almost like a bus, flew over the mob and landed on the other side safe. They almost made a Rajnikant out of that driver. And this is very natural. Nobody asked them to do it. They did it spontaneously because they relished doing it. Because there is somebody inside us, the eternal dramatist inside, who loves drama and the surreal. So we mythologize everything and the good and evil also are no exceptions. Let us say somebody wants to do something good. You want to donate 100 rupees. You think about what will be cool thing to do. Should I donate for environment or should I donate for human rights? What is the more in thing to do? Right? So the surreal comes there also. Even in the way you donate to an NGO, even when you do something good, you want to do something good and give a lunch to somebody, and you think about what will be in keeping with my image, what should be there and what should not be there on the plate, what looks good and what does not look good. So even in doing good, the surreal comes in there. In the act of doing good, similarly, in the act of doing evil, the surreal comes in there. How words can I torture somebody? And similarly, from tradition and mythology related to good and evil, we have hundreds of stories and hundreds of instances loaded in the surreal. So whatever we do, the good and the evil also are soaked in the surreal, in the way we think about them and in the way we practice them. And I think what is true about good and evil is true for practically everything, that everything is practically soaked in the surreal, whatever we think or whatever we do, except for a small exception of situations and entities which are not in the domain of the surreal and constitute the real.
Sir, I think I've even asked you this question in the previous series, and I'm asking you again because I want an answer to it. So then, if surreal is so real, I mean, if it is there everywhere, what is the reason to get rid of it? Why fight it? Why not just let it be?
Uh, there are two aspects to it: the aspect of mastering and the aspect of getting rid of it. So we don't want to get rid of it. Most of us don't want to. Not only normal people, even enlightened people don't want to get rid of it because it is the reservoir of all the rafa, all the juice. So we don't want to get rid of it. We don't want to become logic machines. We don't want to deprive human existence of all the juice, and the juice is in the surreal. However, we want a mastery that we should be able to, on demand, enter the surreal and come out of the surreal. So we should be using the surreal. Surreal should not be overwhelming us and using us for its purposes. That being the case, that being the goal, both in psychoanalysis and in spirituality, we are not trying to condemn the surreal. We are not trying to get rid of the surreal. We are trying to master the surreal. Now, what does this mastery mean? And what is the depth and scope of this mastery? That's an important question. And the answer is different in psychoanalysis and spirituality. In psychoanalysis, the goal is of maximizing as much as we can reality acceptance and freeing ourselves as much as we can from the hold of fantasy and desires. So this is the goal of psychoanalysis, but we know very well in psychoanalysis, nobody can reach the goal. One can only move towards the goal, be closer to the goal, but no one in psychoanalysis can reach the goal as psychoanalysis believes it. So there is no freedom possible from the surreal within the classical domain of psychoanalytic thinking. When we come to spirituality, the uh, the treatment and the goals are different. In psychoanalysis, uh, although we don't say it explicitly, but reality acceptance is revered more than fantasy. It is implicit, it is not explicitly said, but there is an implicit, very subtle kind of looking down and condemnation of the surreal. Not explicit, but implicit. in practice, not in theory. In spirituality, it is different. One, there is no condemnation of the surreal, and the goal is different. It is believed that a mastery of the surreal is possible, and one attains it when one attains enlightenment. Not that all enlightened people attain it, but all enlightened people attain it to substantial degrees higher than the normal person. And the freedom from the surreal ranges from 70% to 30%, 70% to 100%. That there will be one group of enlightened people who are at the minimum free to the tune of 70%, to the extent of 70%. And in psychoanalysis, comparatively speaking, nobody will go above 30-40%. So even the minimum of spirituality in the zone of enlightenment is radically different from the best possible for an ordinary person. And so for some people, even 100% freedom is possible. The question then is what happens after that? If 100% freedom is possible, then do you again use it consciously or you just don't use it? And there, two approaches come in. Some people don't use it at all, very rarely, very rare people. They don't use surreal at all and they communicate in a very particular language called the Sandhya Bhashan, the evening language. And there is one flavor of the evening language which is completely purified of the surreal. And this calls for a lot of inner work. And the second is where a second flavor of Sandhya Bhasha, where the pleasant part of the surreal, the sublime part of the surreal is used for conscious experience and in language. And there is a conscious use of the sublime part of the surreal in the language. So this is how the freedom and not freedom exists. An ordinary individual can never be free from it. It is beyond his capability because he cannot. Every normal individual has to live in fantasy and reality together. It is beyond his capability to choose to be in only one domain. He can neither be only in reality nor in the fantasy. It's beyond his capability to choose. Both will be there by virtue of the way the hardware and the operating system is. So ordinary person cannot be free from it. Those who are enlightened, for them, some are just free to the tune of 70%, and some are completely free. And then they operate choice of to use or not to use the surreal. That is one part. The second part is, as ordinary individuals, do we want to be free from the surreal? The answer for most is no, because the surreal is a reservoir of all pleasures. It is a reservoir of all rasas, all juices, and most people don't see the strange hold of surreal as a problem at all. They are so strangulated by the surreal. The strange hold of the Maya is so strong that they can't even see that they are in a stranglehold. It requires some level of spiritual development for somebody to even realize that he is in the strange hold of the surreal of the Maya and a desire to get out of it. And then slowly a long process begins. But after a few years, he is free to the tune of 10-20%, 15, 10, sorry, 5 to 10% only. Another decade and maybe it's 15%, and so it goes. And it takes a long time before he can be substantially free of the surreal.
Sir, I hear you say Navras. So how is surreal related to Navras in the Indian aesthetic?
If you take the Nav Rasas of Indian aesthetics, the 9 fundamental entities of feeling, as the Indian aesthetics defines it, the concept of Navrasa was put forward by Bhartrihari, and some people also call him Bharat Muni. And his Navrasa theory, which is the base of Indian aesthetics, art and dance, and Indian music. One of the bases, not the only base, one of the bases. Uh, basis in terms of expression and practice, not the base in ontological terms. That's a different base altogether. So, if you look at the Navrasas of Indian aesthetics, all the Navrasas are in the surreal. Not a single rasa is in the real. Which means you will have to define a new uh, rasa for the real if you experience a rasa there. You can call it the Satya rasa. But that Satya definition is very different. It is not actually the real as we define it because Satya also is in the surreal. So you will have to define some new uh, rasa for that particular area of the real, and all the nine are in the surreal. Now the interesting part is, if you take up each of the rasas of Indian aesthetics and try to find out how the surreal operates with respect to each rasa, it will lead us to the development of the concept of the surreal and also to a better understanding of the rasa itself, how the rasa psychologically works. And once you have it, you can take this to the domain of arts and enrich that domain. So it's a very interesting exercise to see how the surreal operates in a more fundamental way with respect to each of the rasas, and that will be an episode by itself, surreal and the navrasas. So one way to do it is to take up one story, one myth, or one song of each of the rasas and see how we can apply the surreal concept there and how we can understand it with that concept. And then once you have many examples, you can come to the generic understanding of how, in terms of scope and the depth and the flavor, the concept of surreal can be used to understand and develop understanding of each of the rasas. And then take it to the arts for more enrichment. But yes, uh, one thing we can look at in a more interesting way, we can look at how the surreal is operating uh, in archetypal terms.
Yeah, yes.
That in each of the Jungian archetype, how is the surreal operating? And in the Jungian analysis of the dream, how is the surreal operating? And then combine that with our rasa theory. And this will be a very interesting combination for somebody to work on. It is almost like a subject of a thesis, a much wider and deeper subject. But to combine the Rus theory, the archetypes, and the concept of the surreal will be quite a intellectual feast to really get into.
I like this Satya Rasa. So, isn't that anywhere is reality acceptance leading you, I mean, freeing you from the surreal? Is it?
Uh, it provides the way reality acceptance happens in psychoanalytic psychotherapy. It provides you freedom from the strange hold of the surreal in specific terms most of the times. Say, for example, in the sexual area, you analyze something in the therapy room and you are freed from one particular set of fantasies and you do reality acceptance in that context. Then another fantasy comes, the third fantasy comes. So the freedom is very localized and specific. When you do it many times over related to a particular drive, then it becomes slowly generic, but in a very small amount. So we are not dealing with freedom in a more fundamental sense. We are dealing more with the specific sense. Second element is uh, reality acceptance often has to be followed by mourning. And that mourning itself is a Karun Rasa. So reality acceptance is followed by an entry into a rasa, and then the freedom comes. So the surreal and the rasa are there in the psychoanalytic process. We don't talk about it as such, but if we were to Indianize psychoanalysis, we would be using these terms. And it is interesting to see how uh, the sense of wonder, the Adbhut Rasa, is experienced in therapy. How each of the rasas is experienced in psychoanalytic psychotherapy, and that by itself is another thesis topic. How each of the rasa is experienced in psychoanalytic psychotherapy. And this will be different based upon the person and the pathology of the person. Coming back to the center of the question, uh, reality acceptance does lead to some freedom from the surreal, but it's a very circumscribed, local, and small quantum of freedom unless one pursues one particular drive and all fantasies related to that drive in detail and then come back to the generic freedom of surreal related to that drive, the freedom is not substantial. So fantasies keep coming up, surreal keeps taking stage hold of our minds, desires keeps working through the surreal, and we keep refining and purifying ourselves to the extent that we can. Uh, and Therefore, the psychoanalytic path is very inefficient and very slow, I would say. When it comes to the freedom from the surreal, it happens, but uh, too small and too slow.
So, can the surreal be consciously engaged, in our lives to enrich our life?
It can be because the rasa is there, the juice is there, the pleasure is there. To use a Lacanian term, the juisa is there.
And does culture and spirituality offer us such guidance? I mean, is it been
Yes,
done?
yes. Uh, Culture offers us, and spirituality also offers us rituals, traditions, and modes of uh, celebrating festivals and modes of worship. And if we look particularly in the Indian culture and Indian spiritual tradition, in Indian culture, the festivals are celebrated in a particular way, where in a particular way the surreal is engaged with. And there is a calendar full of festivals across the year, and each festival has associated with itself a mythology, a ritual, a way of socially gathering together and performing certain actions, a diet plan of particular food, and a prescription of spiritual practices. With every festival, this entire package is there. So it's a spiritual package with culture embedded within spirituality. So the center is spiritual and the culture is on the surface. So this package in Indian culture and Indian spirituality and both fused together quite a bit, that offers us a very sublimated way of engaging and enjoying the surreal. Indian spirituality also uses uh, the surreal for personal exploration and personal growth in practices of idol therapy, in practices of yantra and mantra, in practices of storytelling and story hearing, in practices of rituals, and in the consumption of mythology. In all these areas, uh, and also mystical practices of Avishkar, Swapneshwari, idol worship, and so on. In all these practices, uh, how to engage with and how to take gratification from and use for spiritual growth, the surreal is has been explored basket full of standardized tools created in the Indian culture and spiritual domain. And as an individual, even by a personal reflection and choice, if one is psychologically and spiritually sophisticated enough, knowledgeable enough, one can even by oneself engage with the surreal to gratify it in a sublimated way and be slowly free from the surreal, taking help from a therapist or a guru, or by practicing oneself a basket full of tools that culture and spirituality across the world offer us. Every ancient culture and every ancient spiritual tradition offers us a basket full of tools. It is for us to create our own basket based upon what we find most convenient and most relishable.
Sir, and last question, modernity. How does surreal, what is the role of surreal in this modern world and its relation?
The surreal cannot be banished from human civilization because it is embedded inside of us. And like a fountain, it springs out from inside to everywhere. I mean, the the trees and the mountains don't give us our surreal. It is human beings which create the human surreal. And human beings create the human surreal because, like a fountain, it springs out from inside. Our hardware and our operating system are such that we are bound to create our surreal. In Jungian terms, it is archetypally structured in our psyche. Structurally, our psyche has archetypes. Even if you don't believe in the Jungian model of mind, you can still say that the hardware and the operating system are such that we are fated, we are destined. We have no choice but to create the surreal that we create. The question is, what is the flavor of that surreal? If we look across historical periods, different periods of history have different myths and different way of expressing, living, and being inspired by and using surreal for growth. If we look at pre-modern times, the zone of the myth, the zone of the expression of the archetypes in every individual and in society was very different. What modernity has done is it has uh, pushed to the background, almost assassinated the surreal expression in terms of mythology, in terms of archetypal expression, and in terms of traditional expression and traditional uh, and in terms of traditions. Instead, it has substituted that expression of the surreal by what is called the corporate surreal. So corporate communication creates the new myths of today. And these are very superficial, artificial, rootless myths. And therefore, when we accept these myths and we start living by those myths, we find ourselves without an anchor, rootless. We don't feel wholesome. We don't feel our feet are touching the ground. We don't feel rounded. We feel rootless. And this is where the corporate surreal has actually contaminated the sphere of the surreal. And it has created a surreal completely unnatural and driven by corporate needs. Similarly, governments and autocratic dispensations, they also create their surreal. The Nazis created their surreal. If we look at neighboring Pakistan, they have created their whole fictitious surreal of Pakistan's history. If we look at the religious fanatic leaders, they create a fictitious surreal of their past. and a fictitious surreal of the future. The corporate surreal actually is the main culprit in today's times, that we are not in touch with our traditions and our archetypal surreal and our mythological surreal because of the corporate surreal. Because the corporate surreal is created not with the purpose of addressing a deep need in the human psyche, but for corporate profits. So it's a very narrow, superficial, rootless, and hedonistic kind of surreal with a goal to seduce you into buying something. So the whole surreal is geared towards creating needs which don't exist. So the whole surreal has one purpose, that is of manufacturing needs to sell you products. And this is something we have to be aware of. And as a society, we have to fight this corporate surreal and rediscover and re-bring in into our center of our lives the surreal expression which was there in our mythology, which naturally comes out of our archetypal domain and which was there in our traditions, and allow this natural living and expression of the surreal at the level of individual and society. And this is something we have, it's a very subtle thing. It is too subtle to be understood by the masses, but we have a duty to create some social communication, whatever resource we have, with whatever resource we have, to fight this battle and bring the natural surreal back to the center of human and social life. Sort of rescue the surreal from the corporates.
Yes, that was nicely put, sir. Well, we've explored today an interesting and a deeply elusive topic. You do write to us at hvindia@gmail.com and keep watching. Thank you. Namaste, sir.
Namaste.